and dearly beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with one another, forgive one another, if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Then there's a section on the peace of Christ ruling in our hearts and family life, verses 18 to 21. Then we come to a passage I'm going to look at more carefully shortly. Verse 22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to carry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It's the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs. There is no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Now notice the shift, therefore, in chapter 3. What Paul is saying is, if then we are in Christ, what are the implications for daily living? One great thinker in the last century, Francis Schaeffer, the American apologist who founded the L'Abri community in Switzerland, referred to the beginning of chapter 3 as what he called spirituality for the kitchen sink. This is a strange phrase. It basically means practical or applied spiritual living. If Christ is Lord, what are the implications for how then we should live? And in that first passage I just read, chapter 3, verses 1 to 10, what he tries to highlight is the importance of a new morality or a new lifestyle for those who own Christ in his lordship. And notice, if we look very briefly at that passage, it speaks about how you've been raised with Christ, verse 3. You have died and your life is hidden with Christ in verse 3. And verse 4 refers to the future. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then also you appear with him in glory. Let me see here now. I think we missed a page. Or maybe it comes... Yeah. Let's look at this page then. A new morality. So what he says here in verses 1 to 10 are the distinctives of the new life that the Christian has. And he highlights, really, he's building on what's happened before, where he's talked about acknowledging the sovereignty of the lordship of Christ, and now spells out the implications. And there are two dangers, I think, as we seek to live under the lordship of Christ. The one is living like a humanist. Is one of these other mics here alive? Can I use this one? Could you just bring this alive? And I'm going to need two chairs here. Thank you. This is the danger that some of us run. This is a chair which symbolizes a Christian living like a humanist. This is a chair which symbolizes a Christian who is living under the sovereignty of Christ and seeking to apply his lordship to every area of society. So the humanist, Christian living like a humanist, and the person living under the sovereignty and lordship of Christ. Christian living like a humanist. I wonder how much of my money I should give to God. That person living under the lordship of Christ. I wonder how much of God's money I should keep for myself. Christian living like a humanist. I'm going to marry the most handsome or good-looking person I can find, no matter what their value system is. Christian under the lordship of Christ. I'm looking for a spouse who can team up with me so that we can be more effective as a team in serving Christ than if we were just two individual Christians. I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to serve. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to seek to please Christ in all things. Saturday, Sunday, and during the rest of the week. I'll worship on Sunday. I'll worship 7 days a week in my lifestyle. See, the danger for many of us is, thank you. The danger is of this kind of dualism, which really comes from the Greek thinker Plato, who tried to imply that the spiritual, as it were, was separate and superior to the physical. What Paul argues in his writings here is that Christ is the Lord over every area of society, and we shouldn't live like humanists or as dualists, separating Sunday from the rest of the week, or living as if we're indistinct from the rest of the world. Now, in the 1980s, I remember visiting Romania, and I visited the home of a famous Christian pastor called Joseph Tson. At that time, Romania was a communist state under the President Ceausescu, who was a terrible leader. And the government was very concerned about the growth of juvenile delinquency in the country at the time. And so they commissioned a professor of sociology to do some research about why delinquency was increasing amongst adolescents and teenagers across the country. But they never published the results of this research. When the sociologist did this research, he discovered, and he was a communist himself, that delinquency was increasing across every area of society amongst teenagers, with the exception of 3 groups of people. And they were young people associated with 3 churches: Brethren, Baptist, and Pentecostal, 3 main evangelical churches in the country, where delinquency was virtually 0. In other words, what he had discovered was that there was a new morality, as it were, which came from those who were following and dependent on living in the light of the lordship of Christ in every area of society. That's what Paul is highlighting here. Secondly, then he goes on to explain the new relationships which occur as a result of the lordship of Christ. And in that passage, we began to read the implications in the life of the church, because the passage is written to the whole church, not just to individuals, putting on kindness, compassion, and so on. And then family life, also wives, husbands, children, fathers, and so on. Let me just highlight one brief illustration there about one change that takes place. Paul, in verse 11 of chapter 3, says, "Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and in all." What Paul is highlighting, and this is what is radical in the New Testament, is the formation of a new community which cuts across ethnic and cultural divides as people become one in Christ. Verse 12 talks about them as God's chosen people. God's people are part of a new humanity, a new society, and in this sense we are to be a testimony or a witness to the watching world. Let me illustrate this from my own travels. Once, I remember visiting Zimbabwe and talking with some students who had been involved in the student ministry in the late 60s. And they told me at that time there was a civil war in Zimbabwe between black and white. And in the main restaurant, or the Mensa, in the university in the capital city, Harare, black and white students ate their meals separately on different tables, except for one group of people who met at a dinner table right in the center of the restaurant or the Mensa. They were the members of the Christian student group, where black and white students in the middle of a civil war were eating their meals together. And this is what they did. They didn't say a word. They didn't preach. First of all, the white students went to get the main course and came and served it publicly to their black brothers and sisters. They were stating that our identity in Christ, our unity, our reflection of being new men and women means that we are tied to these people who are now our brothers and sisters in Christ. So they served the black brothers and sisters. Then afterwards, the black brothers and sisters went and got the dessert and came and served it publicly to the white brothers and sisters. So it was like electricity. They were making a public statement that in Christ there is neither black nor white, but there is a new man and a new woman, as it were. I remember speaking on this theme in my home church in South Wales and saying in the church, you know, we Welsh people have more in common with English Christians than with Welsh pagans. And I could hear many people in the congregation go, ooh. And afterwards, as I was greeting people as they were leaving the church, one elderly lady, it's a wonderful Christian in her mid-80s, came up to me and she said, Lindsay, I know you're right. It's just so hard to love them because of what they did to us in the past. And maybe sometimes you feel like that. But actually, what it means to be a new man, part of the new creation, the new community of Christ, means that our unity with believers from other cultures, despite history, should be stronger than with our own culture and with pagans within it. Now, that doesn't mean we should be uninterested in our culture. God didn't make me Welsh by mistake. I love my culture, but the deeper identity comes from being in Christ, new relationships. Well, that's just one example of that. Now then, let's move on to how Paul deals with how we relate to the world. This is in all of Paul's teaching, incidentally, through the New Testament. Historically, Christians have tended to take one of three views when it comes to how we relate to the world. The first view is of separation. Come out from amongst them. Be separate. Separate yourselves from the world just in case you may be tarnished by it. And this is a dominant view throughout the history of the church. In some ways, it probably led to the monastic system. But certainly, it's often led to Christians separating themselves from the world for fear of being contaminated. Now, I became a Christian and grew up in a church that had this kind of approach. We had a very big youth group of 200 teenagers. But the church leaders were so fearful that the young people in the church would become contaminated by the world that they arranged a meeting every night of the week for us. Because they said, if you get too close to the world, you'll be contaminated and you lose your faith. So be separate. Cut yourself off. Well, that was one approach. Second approach, which is often a reaction against this, is assimilation of the world into the church. If you can't beat them, join them. And often this is manifested in our approach, for example, to corruption in cultures where it's very difficult to resist corruption. Now here I have a book which is on the bookshelf I looked at last night. It's a really good book by former Vice President of the European Union, Sir Fred Catherwood, which deals with this whole question of dealing with corruption, particularly in government and business. And he wrote this as a result of meeting with students from Africa and Russia in an international student conference who said to him, the corruption is so pervasive and endemic in our culture, it's impossible to resist it. So he wrote this book as an encouragement to people living in those cultures. And you might want to pick up a copy afterwards. The response of many has been, well, you can't beat them, so you might as well give in to corruption. It's affected also theological reflection. So it led to the birth of so-called liberal theology, where people said the challenge of certain scientific approaches means that we can't believe in the resurrection of the dead, so we'll just say that Jesus symbolically rose from the dead. It wasn't a bodily resurrection. There's no evidence for miracles, so we deny the miraculous and we explain them away. It's impossible that Jesus could have been God, so we say he was just a prophet or a good man. That's assimilation of the worldviews into the church. But the third approach, which I think is the biblical approach, is engagement. Being engaged in society without taking on its corrosive and corrupting elements. And here are two beautiful quotations. The first one is a brilliant quotation from John Stott, which I hope you will remember above all else this morning.